Hello everyone, welcome to Asian Studies. We're going to be briefly getting into this unit today, Clash of Civilizations, Imperialism, and Colonialism. So we're looking at the land of India specifically, and in our previous units, this is Unit 6, but in Unit 5 we looked at the Silk Routes and we talked about cultural diffusion and how the effects of trade, philosophies, and technology affect society, right? Now, for this unit, we're going to be looking at imperialism and colonialism and how those affected society. So we'll be looking at European explorers in Asia and discussing some of the factors that really enabled these Europeans to increase their trade relationships within Asia. So here's our objective and our essential question for today. Compare and analyze factors that enabled Europeans to increase their trade relationships with Asian empires after the 15th century. And then our essential question for today is, how do cultural differences lead to conflict? So this is going to be really an introductory lecture, and I'm going to give you just a brief background to set up the context of what we're going to be discussing for the next month or so as we look at imperialism and colonialism in Asia. Now, for this essential question, how do cultural differences lead to conflict? I want you to be thinking about that throughout this unit. And I also want you to be thinking about this objective. Compare and analyze these factors that enabled Europeans to really increase their trade relationships throughout the 15th century, the 16th century, the 17th century, and the 18th century as we go further on into the unit. So, this is going to be how we do this for this lecture. I'm just going to call it listen and repeat. I'm going to have an image up on the slide, a few questions, and then I want you to listen to what I'm saying, my answer to these or my explanations to these questions, and then I want you to just kind of give me a recap of what I've said in relation to these questions on the screen. So, Vasco da Gama. This is Vasco da Gama. What is his demeanor based on this image, right? Well, if anybody's having a portrait done during this time period, they probably have wealth and significance, right? Authority. So Vasco da Gama is a Portuguese explorer. He was born in the 1460s, and really like Columbus, he was relatively unknown until his extraordinary voyage to India after he took his ships past the Cape of Good Hope in southern Africa. And based on this image, we can just look here on a few things. Where is he, right? Context, where is this guy? Well, it looks like he's on a ship. The reason I can say that is because behind him, it looks like there's ships behind him, and he seems to be at a port. So he's probably at the port of Lisbon in Portugal, right? A few other things he's holding on to. He's got some kind of astronomical map there to help him on his voyage to India, right? He's got a sword here, and he's got something around his neck. It looks like he has a cross around his neck, so that probably tells us that he is Catholic, maybe. Okay, so what's this guy's significance? Well, he was the first explorer to travel from Europe to India by sea in 1498, and he changed the world economy forever, making a damaging blow to the Silk Road and the overland routes. So prior to Vasco da Gama, explorers had only reached the southern cape of Africa, right? The Europeans had only reached the southern cape of Africa. So he opened up maritime trade between Europe and Asia. It was because of him that Portugal became a supplier of these very high commodity luxury products like textiles and spices like pepper, and made it into a very powerful nation. So what Vasco da Gama did is essentially the accomplishment of putting a man on the moon really during that time period. So he's very, very significant for European history and Asian history. Okay, so hopefully you had time to answer those questions. We're going to move on here. So when we're looking at European expansion, taking the lead here were the Portuguese, right? who searched for these new routes to Asia that eventually led them to Africa and India. So when we see here, we've got the Portuguese, we've got the Dutch, you've got the British East India Company, who will eventually colonize this entire subcontinent. And then you have the French. Right, so when we look at this question, describe the patterns of world trade during the 15th century. So it's important to remember the Black Plague has happened. That's had a significant impact on the world economy, and so everybody's trying to develop their economies again, right? And these innovative merchants are trying to supplement trade by sea traffic instead of using that traditional transportation of overland goods, right? So prior to 1450, China actually had a significant impact on helping revive this trade in the Indian Ocean, as Zheng He led a fleet there. However, after a time, he had to withdraw due to his death, and then therefore the Chinese declined this major opportunity to really construct a maritime empire in the Indian Ocean. But regardless, the Muslims still dominated a significant region of that area, specifically in Egypt and near the Red Sea. And so what the Chinese did was they helped set up a lot of these new port cities along the coast of Africa, along the Red Sea, in India, in South Asia, and even in parts of Malaysia. And so it's important to remember during this time period, one of the patterns we see is that the Arabs, the Persians, the Indians, and the Chinese merchants are the ones who dominate trade, right? Now, the pattern we see is that the Europeans don't really have a significant role in providing resources, rich resources to this part of the world. They want a piece of the action, right? They want in. So while China is also growing economically, right? You also look at India, and India is expanding as well. Their economic influence mostly by importing and selling textiles and spices like pepper, right? In the exchange for silver. So Europeans were not that significant. They didn't have a lot to offer these Asian countries. So therefore, they wanted to get in on the action. And these European mariners and traders started searching for these new routes to East Asia, exploring the Atlantic coast of Africa for these spices, for slaves, for textiles, and for gold and silver, right? This then in turn would lead them to the next stages of imperialism and colonialism. So these are the broad patterns that we see throughout the world trade during the 15th century. Okay, so looking at this image, it says, analyze the context of this painting and explain how explain how economics and politics were interdependent to European monarchs. So looking at this image, right, we can see the context of it. It looks like Vasco da Gama, and it looks like the king, right? So King Manuel I is having some kind of ceremony, and he's sending off Vasco da Gama for his voyage to India, right? And behind him here, actually, this man, okay, it's Zacuto, and he is a famous astronomer, and he was giving these tools to help with this navigation process of getting to India, right? So when it comes to the next portion of this question, explain how economics and politics were interdependent to European monarchs, right? How did the two of those correlate with each other? How did they associate, right? And honestly, it's still the same today, right? Economies and politics are always there's some sort of alignment, there's some sort of association between those two. So in this case, it's quite clear that mercantilists like Vasco da Gama understood that these two variables were heavily associated, and while merchants need the monarch to protect their interests and provide funds for their expeditions, the monarchs also rely on these businessmen, right? These merchants trade to enrich their own state treasury. Okay, so for Vasco da Gama, his success, yes, he needed the government to support him, but at the same time, the government needed his good business and innovation to bring wealth to the nation of Portugal. For this next question, it says, causation, what factors drove European involvement to Asian society and commerce? So what factors drove this? Well, Portugal, I mean, this is pretty simple. Portugal was a very resourcefully poor nation. They didn't have a lot of resources, all right? And so they wanted to boost their economy, and the way that they could do this was by accessing trade in Asia. And so for many centuries, the source of Eastern goods had trickled, right, into the Mediterranean, through the Middle East, from the Indian Ocean network into Europe. However, the source of supply laid mostly in the hands of the Muslim merchants, predominantly in Egypt. And so while they controlled it, while they monopolized it, they had direct contact with Venice, right, Italy. So the Italian commercial city was Venice, and it largely monopolized the European markets of these Eastern goods. And so the Venetians resented the Muslim monopoly of the Indian Ocean trade, and also other Europeans disliked them. They didn't like being so reliant on Venice. They didn't like being so reliant on these Muslims. And so this then in turn circumvented this desire to develop their own trade routes, right? The Portuguese wanted to make their own trade routes. So that's a major factor that led to this European involvement in Asian society and commerce, right? Another major one that we could say has to do with religion. So circumventing these monopolies, we also see religious and political motivations for the Portuguese in this case. So they want to spread Catholicism, right? So as the Crusades combated against common Islamic enemy during this goal of the Portuguese voyages, they would then in turn see religion and politics kind of work together in their favor. So in fact, when Vasco da Gama got off of the boat or the ship in India, his first words were, "I'm looking for gold and Christians." Okay, so that kind of goes to tell you right there what the intentions of his journey was. Okay, so what does this map display? Why did Vasco flee so far from the coast of the continent at the start here of going around the Cape of Good Hope? Well, so this displays Vasco's journey from Lisbon to Calcutta, India. Obviously, you can't see Lisbon here on this map. It's not on the map. But Bartholomew Diaz, previously, he was the one who explored the way to get to the southern Cape of Good Hope. And that's down here. And so Vasco da Gama comes out here. He ventures off the coast basically to just gain momentum from prevailing winds along the coast to be able to get around this cape and land somewhere near Mozambique. All right. So this is why he did that. Now, when we're talking about the second question here, comparison, analyze the factors that enabled the Portuguese to increase their trade relationships with India and assess their significance. So what were the factors? What were the main factors that enabled Portuguese to increase their trade relationships in India? There's three that I'm going to discuss. So the first one is the fact that they had innovations in maritime technology, right? So they had these boats called caravels, and they had these triangular sails, and this enabled the Europeans to do many different things. One, it allowed them to kind of nose in and out of these estuaries, which were the coastal rims where the freshwater met the sea. And then the major thing these ships allowed them to do was a sailing technique, and it was called tacking. And so that basically allowed these ships to navigate right directly through these unprecedented winds straight on and still stay on course, right? It still allowed them to go directly into the wind and progress to their destination. So this was huge as that's why no one could get around this cape, was because of those winds. They were so strong, and it was incredibly difficult to actually make it up here. So the next we're going to look at is, well, the fact that since the Chinese fled from the Indian Ocean in the 15th century, it really left the Indian Ocean wide open, and there was no major power in position to really dominate these sea lanes, right? Yes, as I did say, the Muslim merchants controlled this region of trade in the Indian Ocean. However, those boats, what the Europeans soon found was that they weren't really heavily armed. These merchant ships, they were not heavily armed. They lacked cannons like the Portuguese, and so they were kind of able to take over. And what they did was they instilled these they made them sign these things called cartais, and these cartais were basically duties that they had to pay, or like, I guess you could say taxes, around 6 to 10% of the cargoes on those ships had to be paid to them, to the Portuguese, if they used that sea route from Africa to Europe. And so they monopolized this whole system. And a way that they were able to regulate all of that was they had all these port cities, right? They had the coastal cities, right? And it was known as the Trading Post Empire. That's what the Portuguese developed. And they made and established 40 coastal cities, port cities, by the mid-16th century. And this really allowed them to monopolize. Okay, so these were the three major factors that enabled the Portuguese to increase their relationships in India. Okay, so looking at this image, describe it. What's happening? Who's the man bowing? Is anyone armed in the image? And then let's look at the religious significance of this context here. So it looks like Vasco da Gama is coming to shore somewhere, and in this case it's actually Calcutta, India. So he's finally made it to the location that he's been desiring to reach for many years, right? It looks like this man in the yellow is of some political importance, probably some type of governor, and he's there to meet Vasco and his travelers, to greet them and then maybe probably take them to the king. And it does seem as though there are soldiers around him in the red with some type of weapon, right? And it looks like he came on some type of human-powered vehicle, right? So he's probably of great wealth and importance. Now, when we look at the religious significance here, you kind of see here in the background, there's some large temples. Okay, if this is India, right? What's the main religion there, right? Hinduism. There's a large amount of Hindu influence in southern India. So the Mughal Empire still hasn't been established in this region of the world yet, right? That's going to come later, around 1526, when it's established. Okay, so it's not established just yet. At this point in time, there's not a great deal of Muslim influence. There's certainly Muslim influence in this part of the world, as they kind of control trade in the Indian Ocean network. But yeah, you see a lot of Hindu temples. And interestingly, the Portuguese thought that they were Christians at first. That was their understanding, is that they were Christians, and that these temples were Christian churches, right? So they believed that the Crusaders believed that there was some mysterious Christian monarch known as Prester John, and they thought that he ruled somewhere in Asia or northern Africa. And so when they got there, that was maybe their assumption, is that they were part of that Christian monarch. So when we look at this image, we see here that Vasco da Gama has finally made it to the Zamorin court, and even though he makes it, spoiler alert, but he's rejected, right, by the king Zamorin. And the reasons for this, there's probably cultural reasons. as there may have been some miscommunication between Vasco da Gama and the king, right? From very different parts of the world. However, the major reason why the Zamorin court did not make a trade agreement with the Portuguese was, one, just they didn't need it, right? India was doing very well. It was already very wealthy. It was exporting a lot of goods and making a lot of money through the Indian Ocean. And also, you see that Muslim traders still held a very considerable amount of influence in that Zamorin court, and so they definitely influenced the king's decision, as he didn't make a decision right there in front of Vasco da Gama. It came days later, as the Portuguese were actually there for about 3 months. So while the Zamorin did enjoy the company of the Portuguese, he didn't really see a need to develop some sort of trade relations with them. So although the treaty was rejected, what benefits came from this trip? Well, a lot of great benefits came for the Portuguese in this trip. So although the treaty was rejected and denied by the Zamorin court, it was still a huge demonstration of the possible wealth that could be achieved to this route with the Indian markets in the future. So because Vasco da Gama found this route to India, he really succeeded in making Portugal, again, this high supplier of these high commodity products, these luxuries like pepper, right, the spice trade in the European markets, and it would make them a very wealthy nation and a trade monopoly in that region of the world for basically the next 100 years, and they would kind of pave the way for future European countries like the French and the Dutch and the British to kind of take that same route that they were using, and then eventually establish their own trade cities. Okay, this is going to be our last slide for today. So we're looking at the development of the Mughal Empire and kind of the decline of the Portuguese influence in this region of the world. So eventually, around 1526, the Mughal Empire begins to extend its influence in India and becomes the actual empire over that subcontinent. Eventually, they'll control the entire subcontinent, and during this time, during the 16th century, the Portuguese trade monopoly begins to fall apart at the end of the 1500s, right? And you see by the 1600s, the Portuguese are now in a very steep decline in this overextended trade network that they can no longer control, right? So what are the main factors that lead to Portugal's decline? The fact that they were just overextended in the Indian Ocean trade. They did not have the resources to keep up with it, right? You had all of these other countries with more resources and more abilities to control and wanted to be a part of this spice trade, right? The Mughal Empire wanted to, right? Mughal India, Persia, right? Also other European countries like the British, the Dutch, and the French. They gradually contested Portugal's efforts to monopolize the spice trades for themselves. So this is really the major factor that led to Portugal's decline, is the fact that they were just overextended and could no longer control this network. So we're going to be going next into talking about the British East India Company and their influence in this region of the world, and how eventually they're going to be the ones who monopolize India. And then eventually, after the Sepoy Mutiny, they're going to eventually colonize India. So, all right, that's it for today. We'll see you guys next time.